Hello and welcome to Notorious Minds, where we examine those that have altered destiny and changed human history. Just a disclaimer, this video is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This is the story of teenage love that goes diabolically wrong. The Nicole Kasinskas story. Nicole Kasinskas was born in 1987 to Anthony Kasinskas and Jean Domenico. Now, Nicole's father, Anthony, divorced her mother, Jean, when she was 11 years old. Nicole became angered at the fact that her father left, especially since after he left, he rarely had a relationship with her. Nicole would say later that she was extremely angry. At this pivotal time in a young girl's life, a father reveals the kind of man her daughter should choose. Since their relationship was non-existent, it produced anger in her. Jean was a loving single mother that worked 3 jobs at an elementary school. She also coached baseball at a park and worked at a 7-Eleven to support her family. A lot of the times, Nicole would have to take care of her brother while her mother was working, which added to Nicole's introverted lifestyle. Nicole had never had a boyfriend before because she was shy. Her mother became her best friend. Jean began seeing Christopher McGowan in October of 2000, whom she worked with, and they ultimately became engaged. Even though Chris treated Jean's kids like his own, Nicole still felt isolated and alone. Nicole's focus became her schoolwork. She got fulfillment out of her exemplary honor roll record. Nicole's grades became her identity. She always followed the rules in school. Eventually, Nicole said she wished her parents would have acknowledged the hard work she performed in school. Nicole always followed the rules when she was younger, but Nicole was a loner and got used to being that way. It is said it's not good for a person to be alone, and that is true. And based on her choices, the world would learn why. If someone had reached out to Nicole, her life decisions would have most likely been different. Her parents would not talk about the divorce to her, which she resented. Nicole would eventually go on to say she loved her mother, but the communication wasn't that great. Eventually, her feelings toward her mom would change. I think that considering Nicole's good grades, her parents thought that she was doing okay. So Nicole goes online in order to make a connection. A young girl's first love can be very intense, where you never want to be away from that other person. But Nicole Kasinskas' first love will alter many lives. In May of 2002, Nicole Kasinskas met Billy Sullivan through internet messaging service over the internet. Nicole lived in Nashua, New Hampshire with her mother Jean and her younger brother Charlie Kasinskas. Billy lived with his family in Connecticut. His father was an alcoholic and abandoned the family when Billy was young. Billy was also assaulted by a neighbor when he was younger. At that time, Billy was 16 and Nicole was 14 when they met. The two began communicating daily through internet, letters, and phone calls. He was a handsome older boy who showed interest in her. He would always flatter Nicole with his words. In spite of the distance, their relationship intensified. They professed their love for each other only a few days after talking to each other, and even spoke of marriage. This long-distance love of about 100 miles would eventually result in a diabolical plan. Nicole's relationship with Billy became everything to her, for she felt she was not getting love anywhere else. Eventually, Nicole told her mother about Billy. Initially, Jean was happy for Nicole because she knew Nicole did not have any friends. William, aka Billy, was in his junior year in high school when they met. His grades in school were good, and he worked at a local fast food. But Billy had mental issues, and his mother, Patricia, became concerned when he stopped taking his medication. Billy's father was an alcoholic who had abandoned his family when Billy was just a little boy. His mother as well was an alcoholic. Billy had been taking medication for anxiety since he was 6 years old. By 16, Billy was doing well, but when he met Nicole, he stopped taking his medication, for it was better for him sexually if he was off his med. When they finally decided to meet, Jean even drove her the 100 miles for Nicole to meet Billy. Because Billy did not have a license, they were finally able to meet in August of 2002. They will also meet again later in 2002 and started talking about marriage. The couple decided that they wanted to live together in Connecticut. But in November of 2002, Nicole told Billy their desire to live together wouldn't happen because her mother wouldn't allow it. Billy's hatred of Nicole's mother would start from there. From this point, they were talking on the phone every day. Billy would become the dominant one in the relationship. Nicole would do whatever made him happy. Nicole started fighting with her mother about their relationship. Billy would eventually get his driver's license in the spring of 2003, which made it easier for them to see each other. In the summer of 2003, Jean allowed them to visit with each other without adult supervision. A mistake. Nicole tried to persuade her mother to let her move in with Billy. When Jean objected to this plan, the two asked Jean would she allow that Nicole be legally emancipated. My question would be, if she wouldn't let you live with him, why would she agree to emancipation? I'm just saying. Jean was angry and refused their request. Mom was also angry at Nicole for making other moves for cohabitation, like opening a joint bank account with Billy. Mom's ongoing disapproval of such ideas created hostility and resentment in both Billy and Nicole. Billy would talk about killing himself when he would have to leave Nicole and go back to Connecticut. This would terrify Nicole because she couldn't bear losing Billy. Nicole's self-worth became built around her relationship to Billy. Enraged with her mother's answer, they both would start to hate Jean. But a naive teenage girl could only see what she wanted, and this was to live with her boyfriend. But to Billy and Nicole, that was not rational. They should be able to be with each other because of their great love. This is when the roots of evil started brewing. It was August 6, 2003. Christopher McGovern and Jean Domenico, who worked together at the same employer, didn't talk much at work. They didn't let their relationship affect their work. So other than saying hello and sharing the occasional lunch, they kept their work life separate from their personal relationship. At 4:30 p.m. on August 6, when Chris walked over to Jean's desk, he wanted to let her know that he was leaving for the day. They decided that Chris would go home and take a shower and then meet at Jean's house between 7 and 7:30 p.m. Jean would pick up dinner for them on her way home at her favorite pizza place. Every night at 5:30 after she got home, she would clean up the kids' mess. She would never make them responsible for doing that. I would say that can also cause a child to feel entitled and irresponsible. Chris told her many times that Nicole and Charlie needed to be responsible for themselves. The kids never picked up their belongings or trash and just threw them anywhere. She worked so hard, but Jean didn't think twice about cleaning up after them. In fact, she didn't like it when Chris came over while she was cleaning up after them because he would tell her that the kids need to do it themselves. Around the time that Jean left work, Billy and Nicole left the house on Domain Avenue in Billy's black Chevy Cavalier. This was a car Billy's mother had signed a $3,000 loan for him a few weeks earlier. Billy was supposed to go back to Connecticut today, so Billy and Nicole were spending their last supposed moments together. Poor Nicole didn't have any idea when she would see her beloved boyfriend again, and they did not know if she was going to be allowed to visit him in Connecticut. They had started calling each other husband and wife after they had a mock wedding ceremony the last time she visited him in Connecticut. Since Billy referred to Nicole as his wife, that made Nicole feel loved and secure. Because Nicole was desperate for love, it made her feel secure and attention. During the 15 months that Nicole and Billy were a couple, they had only seen each other a few times. They thought they were in so much love, but really it was just lust. Nicole's relationship with Billy was filling a void she wasn't receiving at home. She didn't have friends at school, and in fact she had experienced some bullying in her sophomore and junior years in high school. There was actually an incident where one of the girls had pulled down her sweatpants, not knowing that Nicole wasn't wearing underwear, so that had been quite humiliating. It was right outside of school, so that had to be horrible. Even though Nicole was an honor roll student, she had never made plans for the future, so Billy was all that she had. They had discussed moving into Billy's mother's house in Connecticut together, and they even talked about running away to Vermont or New York. So as Chris drove home to shower and change that evening of August 6th, he was looking forward to a quiet Wednesday night of eating pizza, watching TV, and maybe playing some board games with Jean's kids. He felt confident that the situation with Billy and Nicole would resolve itself. Chris had never married before he had met Jean. He lived a life of a bachelor, also his romantic life before Jean had some troubles. He'd been lied to and mistreated, and now he was happy because with Jean things were different. He absolutely trusted her and saw her as a life partner. It was close to 7 o'clock by then, and he decided to phone Jean to see if she needed anything for him to bring anything over. So he called her, and the phone rang about 6 times. It was not usual for Jean not to answer the phone. Jean was the type of person constantly doing things to stay busy. Charlie, Jean's son, was at a friend's house, and according to the note Billy left on the kitchen counter to Jean, Billy and Nicole were out at the local bowling alley playing pool. At the bottom of this short note, Billy said that if Jean needed to get in contact with him, to just call his cell phone. Now, this note wasn't really out of the ordinary. Nicole had always been good about telling Jean where she and Billy were, since he had been staying with them for the last week. Chris checked his email and decided to try calling Jean at home one more time. Now it was a few minutes after 7, and she still wasn't answering. Chris now goes over to the 7-Eleven store, and he looks over at Jean's house, and he sees her car. So he calls her, but still he doesn't get an answer. Just a short time earlier, Nicole and Billy had been parked at that same 7-Eleven. They were desperate to stay together, and they were trying to find a way to keep Billy from having to go back to Connecticut. They were asking themselves why nobody understood their love was real. Nicole was not willing to stand outside of her house and wave goodbye to him as he left. Nicole wanted to talk to her mother one last time and ask her why she was being so stubborn. Billy was leaving the next day. There was nothing they could do about it, and Jean would not change her mind. They had discussed running away. They've even gone to the library looking for directions to upstate Vermont and Niagara Falls. But they didn't have enough money to get very far or to stay anywhere for an extended period of time. She wanted to be emancipated as a minor. She was very focused on doing that, but she would never get her mother to give her permission. So as Chris pulled in Jean's driveway after he left the 7-Eleven, he saw that the family dogs were in the backyard. Chris grabbed a bottle of soda from his front seat and walked through the front door. There were no lights on in the house looking at the door. Chris then noticed that it was ajar, and it seemed like no one was home. So Chris went inside and called out for Jean. Although he didn't notice, when he walked in, the coffee table in the living room was broken in pieces, and the kitchen was a big mess. Everything was just out of place all over. She never would have left things like this. He knew it looked like there had been some kind of struggle in the house. So as Chris walked into the kitchen from the front door, he saw that the refrigerator door was open, and also Jean's feet. He saw them laying on the floor. She had fallen on her face down on the floor. He at first assumed that she had tripped and hit her head on the corner of the stove, or maybe she passed out from some kind of unknown reason and hit her head. Over the past few days, Chris remembered Jean had been complaining of not feeling herself. She had actually called her doctor on Monday, August 4th. After telling Chris that she felt dizzy and fatigued, so he had to think maybe this was related to why she was laying on the floor at this time. He stared at Jean, getting no response. Chris noticed that there was a large pool of blood underneath her head and underneath her shoulders. She had actually bled all over the floor, and it was still wet. What Chris didn't notice at that time was that there was blood all over Jean's kitchen. It was on the refrigerator, the cabinets, the baseboards, the tables, the chair, and the floor. Even the carpet in the living room had some spots of blood. Even the stairs had droplets on them too, so after Chris noticed this blood, he reached for the phone. He then dialed 911. The horror of the situation was beginning to set in. As he spoke to the 911 operator, he was starting to become hysterical, starting to shake. He told the operator the situation, and she said to him to check if Jean was breathing. She wasn't. He knew that something violent had happened recently. He considered the person might still be in the house. Whatever had happened to Jean had just happened within the past hour. When the ambulance arrived, Chris had been kneeling beside Jean. He noticed that her eyes were open, and he realized that she was dead. Police officers, who was only one mile away from Jean's house, responded quickly. Chris was waiting at the door, just looking really in shock. A few more minutes, more officers started arriving, as well as the EMTs and the firefighters. The police had to consider that Chris may have killed Jean. If Jean had been killed by a stranger, then they had to make sure that the killer was no longer in the house. And there could be more victims too. Where are Charlie and Billy and Nicole? The police wondered. The house was searched. Standing outside, Chris fell to his knees and cried. When he finally stood back up, he walked around as an officer followed him wherever he went. More police officers showed up. The entire street was blocked off. Chris stood outside of Jean's house. A detective started asking him questions, information that could be important to finding Jean's killer. As far as the detectives knew, Chris was the prime suspect. He's her boyfriend, and he found her body. The neighbors started coming outside of their houses as the crime scene tape was being put up. Uniformed officers started knocking on doors, asking questions. Jean's ex was the most popular topic of conversation amongst many of the people standing out front, the neighbors. Anthony Kasinskas had a history of being in trouble with the law. He was also known to be violent to Jean, and Jean was terrified of him. There was no doubt Jean had concerns about her ex. As the night wore on and the facts of Jean's death sunk into Chris, he had a hard time accepting that he was never going to see her again. At the scene, a police officer shadowed police, watching everything he did. Because in the eyes of the police, Chris was at the top of their list of suspects. After all, he was her boyfriend. And based on her body, the murder was a crime of passion. And of course, Chris didn't have a solid alibi. So the police asked him to go to the station for some formal questioning, which he did, and he would later say that he never felt like he was treated as a suspect in Jean's death. They never tried to just take him down to the station and get him to confess. Billy Sullivan's mother, Patricia, was in her Connecticut home when she got a call from Billy about 7:30 p.m. that night. According to her, Billy sounded calm. He explained he and Nicole had been driving around town most of the night. They were shopping. He said just two kids in love spending their final night together. As the scene back at Jean's house was being examined, Nicole and Billy were driving around town. So unless they've been watching this scene from afar, neither could have known that the police were there collecting evidence while they were out. Billy stopped at a nearby shopping mall where Nicole bought him a pair of socks and a t-shirt. Then Billy had changed clothes just down the street from Jean's house in the parking lot of a local movie theater. Nicole called home a few times, but of course no answer. They then drove to Rebecca's house, Jean's best friend, and she lived only a few blocks away from Jean. Billy seemed very jumpy. Nicole was more relaxed. They stayed a little while and then they left. In the meantime, Chris was in a small room where the Nashua police had put him for an interview. Chris' arms had the stains of Gene's blood still on them. From the shoulders to his fingertips were covered with Gene's blood. He was wearing shorts at the time, so his knees were covered with blood as well from kneeling down next to Gene's body. 2 detectives sat down at a small table, gave him a glass of water, and told him to relax. Sitting there still in shock at Gene's death, he couldn't imagine life without her. The investigators asked Chris when was the last time he saw Gene. He said it was at work that day because they worked together. And then he explained how they had made plans to meet at her house that evening. Then Chris became worried as he thought about Charlie Kasinskas, and Nicole. How he was going to explain to Charlie and Nicole what had happened to their mother. Charlie had been at a friend's house and Nicole had been out with Billy, and apparently the police were trying to locate them. Then they asked Chris if Gene had any enemies. Chris said Gene's ex-husband, Anthony. In the meantime, the police had located Anthony and he had a solid alibi. When discussing the 2 kids, Chris said that Nicole was a model student and daughter. Then the mention of Charlie as a possible suspect disturbed Chris. He couldn't imagine that Charlie had anything to do with his mother's death. But Charlie would sometimes lose his temper with his mother. Charlie's always had to have his way. He may have got that behavior from his father. Detectives knew immediately upon entering Gene's home that she had been brutally beaten with some sort of blunt, solid object and then stabbed repeatedly with 2 different knives. An early estimate was that Gene had been stabbed 40 to 50 times. She had wounds on her face, neck, head, and throat, as well as many defensive wounds on her arms and her hands. Investigators have found a broken knife handle inside Gene's kitchen sink, and the blade was on the floor. 2 more knives were found out in the backyard. Now here's an interesting thing. Gene was very much against having any knives in her house. Even normal everyday kitchen knives to carve meat or butter knives were not welcome there. As detectives continued to question Chris, he made a point to tell them that Gene hated all knives. It was kind of odd when he first started dating Gene. Chris thought it was weird that a woman who cooked dinner every night for 2 teenagers didn't even own a simple set of knives. Gene told Chris she hated knives, she was terrified to have them, and she didn't own any. When Chris brought up to detectives that Gene was frightened of keeping knives in the house, they asked him for more details because it seemed like Gene had kind of a 6th sense that she was going to be attacked by someone with a knife. She had recently bought a knife set right before her death, unfortunately. She didn't want knives in the house because of her son Charlie, because Charlie had a bad temper. When Charlie was interviewed, he did have an alibi. Charlie would end up going to live with his father, Anthony. Chris put up his arms around Charlie, told him, "We're going to be okay. We're going to get through this. Are you going to be okay? Are you going to be okay living with your father?" Charlie said that he would be okay. Then Charlie looked at Chris in his eyes and said he did it. Chris asked him, "What do you mean?" And Charlie said, "Billy." Chris couldn't believe what he was hearing. He told Charlie it couldn't be true. Charlie was adamant. He said he knew Billy had killed Gene. At about 10:15 that night, Nicole and Billy arrived back at the house. There were still several crime scene investigators and detectives on the scene, and one of the neighbors was standing in the street in front of Gene's house when he recognized Billy's car inching its way up the street. He pointed that out to a police officer at Gene's house because it was close to the corner. As Billy drove closer, several police officers stood in front of the car with their hands up, telling him to stop. The officers rushed to each side of the car as Nicole and Billy got out the car. Nicole asked them, "What's going on?" And the neighbors and friends who knew Nicole and Jean were very concerned for Nicole and wondered how she was going to react to losing her mother. Nicole has always been very close to her mom, so it was important for the police to get independent stories from Nicole and Billy. So they were separated and taken to the police station in separate police cars to be interviewed. Billy was very talkative, and then he began coughing. Billy was put in an interview room at the Nashua police station. He remained talkative, he was read his rights, and agreed to speak without an attorney. Then he spontaneously volunteered that he didn't like police officers, and he said that he had been charged with crimes he didn't commit in the past as a juvenile. Then Billy started talking about shopping with Nicole. That evening, he said they walked around, but they didn't end up buying anything at first. Nicole stuck to the story that she and Billy had agreed on. She even showed the detective receipts from the stores that they had been at, and evidence that they had signed in at the bowling alley that evening. She said that she called her mother several times to let her know her whereabouts, but she didn't get an answer. Then she left a message on Chris McGowan's voicemail. She said that she and Billy had then seen a 7 p.m. showing of Pirates of the Caribbean. But Nicole, in her interview, said that she had also bought some socks and a t-shirt for Billy while they were shopping, and Billy felt the need to wear them that night for some reason. He had changed clothes just down the street from Jean's house, in the parking lot of the movie theater. After that, the two had driven to Jean's friend Rebecca's house. The two detectives who had spoken with Billy and Nicole separately met to compare notes, and that's when they realized that there were some major inconsistencies in their stories. They then returned to the interview rooms, this time with recording equipment. Nicole's stories were quickly falling apart. While Billy spoke to two detectives in one room, Nicole was really messing up in the second room. That's the thing with lies. You have to be consistent in telling them exactly the same way. But the truth is the truth, and it comes out the same every time. Down the hall, Nicole changed her story to one where Billy had been protecting her from her mother in a fight, and he had no choice but to kill her. She said that her mother had come at her with a knife, so Billy had to strike her with a baseball bat. But of course, police did not believe this story because Chris had just told the police that Jean was terrified of knives. Eventually, Nicole finally did begin to tell the truth. The first details pertaining to her mother's murder that Nicole brought up really shocked the investigators. Giving all the details, Nicole admitted that over the past week, she and Billy had tried to kill her mother 4 times. But it hadn't worked, so of course now the murder was a premeditated act. According to Nicole, the 3 previous murder attempts took place in the 4 days leading up to Jean's murder. The first attempt was when they had added Dimetap and Benadryl and ibuprofen to Jean's coffee creamer. Nicole said Billy believed that if they laced the creamer and Jean ingested enough of it, she would die over a period of time. Billy was wrong. Billy explained Jean would become sick and drop dead from an overdose. So although it was Billy's idea and he put the over-the-counter medication into Jean's creamers by himself, Nicole claimed that she stood by him and watched, and she admitted to being culpable because she hadn't tried to stop him. Arsenic would have been better, but I guess I watched too many crime shows. These ideas were from the young and the immature, I'm just saying. Nicole had told Billy that night that it wasn't working. Jean had felt dizzy. Chris admitted later and said that she had gotten sick, but she was able to go to work the next day and function just fine. Billy suggested the next day that they try something else, and that night, when Jean and Chris were asleep, Nicole and Billy stood in the kitchen with the lights off, and they added bleach to her creamer. Bleach. Unbelievable. the lengths they went to for their great love. The next morning, after Jean and Chris had left for work, Billy and Nicole had gone into the kitchen. Jean had thrown the creamer away, believing that it had gone bad. Believe me, you know when you taste bleach. So the next day, Billy came up with another plan. They would set her mother's room on fire. So he is in Jean's room, trying to figure out the best way to leave a burning candle and the best place to leave a burning candle, so it would look like an accident. While Billy searched for the right spot, he asked Nicole to go get him a lighter because he wanted to make sure the blanket caught fire. So Nicole brought a disposable lighter and she held the flame under Jean's blanket, but it was flame retardant and wouldn't ignite. Dumb and Dumber. The fourth was the worst. The fourth was the worst than the first three. So he took a clothesline that he had bought from Home Depot and bought it to Nicole to feed the rope into the oil tank out in the back of the house. He distracted her mother and Chris. Then they poured gasoline along the rope and lit the end of the line so that the flame goes into the oil tank and the house would blow up. So if you didn't know, the houses where they live have oil tanks attached to them in order to heat them in the winter. Nicole went outside, and while Billy was inside the house talking to Jean and Chris, keeping them busy, she put the rope into the oil tank and unraveled the rest of it across the back of the lawn. She then stretched out the line towards the edge of the lawn. These two have no clue. Billy promised the rope would act as a fuse, and once it burned down, it would touch the fuel and it would ignite and it would blow up the house. Then she heard Billy and Chris talking on their way outside. So she didn't want anybody to see her. So she just ran. And she went to the back of the house with the rope in her hand because she didn't want to leave it out there. So that plan fell apart. So after that, Nicole and Billy decided to kill Jean in a way that wouldn't destroy the house and wouldn't risk hurting Chris and Charlie. Aren't they concerned? By this time, the detectives were stunned by their cold and callous nature. They asked Nicole how things had escalated to the point where you and your boyfriend decided to bludgeon and stab your mother to death. My mother didn't want Billy and me to see each other anymore, so since she couldn't get her way like she always did in the past, she thought murder was her next best option. Again, unbelievable. Nicole told them, I wanted to go live with Billy in Connecticut, and my mother would never have let me do that. What a selfish person she had become. Forget about all the years your mother sacrificed for you. So that's her reason that wouldn't hold up in court very well. Nicole would expose an even more shocking revelation as the interview continued into the early morning hours of August 7th. Nicole admitted that she had gone into the house after Billy killed Jean. She went back in the house to get a wet towel for her dear boyfriend to wipe the blood off of his body, her mother's blood off his body. Billy confessed to the police that he had killed Jean so that he and Nicole could live together in Connecticut. So this was clearly premeditated, and it was brutal when some of the facts came out. On August 7th, Nicole admitted that she had gone into the house after Billy killed her mother. She going back into the house to get a towel for Billy, and she had stepped over her mother's dead body to do so. Billy confessed to the police that he had killed Jean so that Nicole and himself could live together in Connecticut. So this was clearly premeditated, and it was brutal when some of the facts of the case were made public on the morning news of August 7th. The people who had loved Jean Domenico couldn't believe that her teenage daughter would do this. You never truly know what is going on in someone else's head. Jean's family and friends thought it was some kind of mistake. Billy must have threatened her or forced Nicole to take part and told her what to say if if anybody questioned her. Maybe he had even threatened to kill Nicole. Everybody admired the way Jean took care of her children, how she worked herself ragged just to support them. Despite working 3 jobs and still barely making ends meet, Jean had a positive attitude, from enjoying life and continuing to care about other people so they just couldn't understand it. On the morning of August 7th, the Attorney General at that time and the Nashua police chief sent out a brief 1-page press release which read in part, William Joseph Sullivan, Jr., age 18, of Willimantic, Connecticut, has been arrested on charges of first-degree murder in connection with the homicide of Jean Domenico, age 43, of Nashua, New Hampshire. What Billy had told the police was enough to arrest him and hold him for murder. A brief description of the charges against Billy added how he had repeatedly stabbed Jean. The press release then gave the most shocking part of the story. The murder charges alleges that Billy acted in connection with and aided by a 16-year-old juvenile. Similar charges had been brought against the minor, so of course that means Nicole. That morning, on August 6th of 2003, Billy and Nicole woke up around 11 a.m. in the morning. I guess they weren't too stressed out about their plan. Now they had the house to themselves, and they sat together on the couch and talked about killing Nicole's mother. They had discussed a plan the day before and decided to step it up. Now they had decided to go through with it. They were better off without Jean's interference, and they could begin their lives together right away. If only my mom wasn't so protective. Really, Nicole had said. You have a car, we could just leave. But Billy shook his head no. The cops will be knocking on my door in 2 days, so murder is better. I'm just saying. So they showered, they had breakfast, and they left the house. Billy would later explain how the plan came together when he and Nicole started talking about it that afternoon, and the more they talked about it, the more convinced they were. So at 4:40 p.m., Billy suggested they go bowling. They had been driving around all afternoon, weighing their options and trying to come up with enough courage either to run away or to confront Jean. Bowling sounded fun to Nicole, plus it was the perfect place to create an alibi, which is the real reason they went there. It was just a 5-minute drive from Jean's home. Nicole kept talking about how depressed they would be if Billy went back to Connecticut the next morning without her. How depressed they would be if Billy went back to Connecticut the next morning without her. This was driving all of their decision making, and they believed that the separation was going to be too devastating for both of them. Spending that last week together had made the bond between them stronger, and Billy's leaving was just now impossible for them to accept. Billy told Nicole, if something were to happen to your mom, then you'd have no choice but to come to Connecticut and live with me. Never mind that she is a minor and has a father. The father ended up taking Charlie, so of course he would end up taking Nicole. Nicole had cried to Billy, I just want more than anything to be with you, she said. She wished more than anything to be with you, she said, and wished her mother understood how great their love was. Jean had been a joke between them for quite a while, but now during this visit it was becoming a real plan. Billy's initial idea of knocking some sense into Jean turned into killing her. They started at the bowling lanes for 30 minutes according to the slip Billy filled out to rent pool balls. After they left, Billy drove to Dunkin' Donuts, which was just down the street. They sat in the parking lot talking and planning what was going to happen in the next few hours. I'll go to the house, explained Billy, and approach your mom with a bat. I'll make it look like a robbery. So when they left Dunkin' Donuts, Billy drove by the house. Driving slowly, he looked toward the house. Jean's car was in the driveway, so Jean was inside with the pizza, waiting for everybody to come home for dinner, clearly having no idea what was awaiting her. When they realized that she was there, they went to the 7-Eleven and parked, where they had a clear view of the house. A police car pulled up and they got paranoid, so they walked into the store with the officer. Then Nicole turned around and she noticed the police officer was behind her paying for a magazine. So they walked back to Billy's car and sat there. Nicole was convinced that their plight had been discovered and that the police officer was following them. After the police officer left, Billy walked toward Jean's house. He decided to turn around, and Nicole didn't try to stop him. Jean sat at her table in the kitchen. She brought home a cheese pizza for Chris and the kids. Now the door opened and Billy walked in, and Jean looked up at him. Jean was surprised to see Billy without Nicole, but she did go back to what she was doing. And Billy walked into Charlie's room, where he planned to grab a baseball bat. He planned to hit her in the head with it. Thought this would be simple and quick, and actually would be far from the truth. Billy returned with the aluminum bat in his hand. He blurted out that he hated the Yankees. That would be the reason for holding the bat and become a conversation piece. Billy put the bat beside the entertainment center in the living room, just outside the kitchen, while talking. Billy and Jean walked into the living room and sat on the couch. Billy picked up the bat and pretended to swing it. "Love those socks," he said, staring down at the bat and gripping it tighter. "Put that down, Billy," said Jean. "It's making me nervous." She seemed very uncomfortable with the way things were going, and she didn't want him to swing the bat in the house. "I used to play baseball," Billy said. He then picked up Jean's cordless phone, which had a separate line in the house, and he called his cell phone, which Nicole had, sitting in the car with her. She was still in front of the 7-Eleven, reading her magazine. "What's going on?" she asked him. "She's getting nervous," whispered Billy, talking about Jean, who had now walked in another room. "You're not going to do it, are you?" asked Nicole. Jean knew who Billy was talking to. "Is that Nicole?" she asked. She walked back into the area of the house where Billy was standing. "Tell her to get her home now." Billy hung up the phone and carried on talking about baseball, trying to keep Jean preoccupied and focus on him rather than Nicole. As he spoke, Jean moved the conversation back to Nicole, demanding to know why she wasn't with him. "What's going on here, Billy?" Jean asked him, and then Nicole's cordless phone rang. Billy picked it up. He knew it was Nicole. Nicole sounded anxious. "There's a cop at the bank," she said as Billy walked away from Jean and into another section of the house. Billy remained calm. "Is he taking money out of the ATM?" And Nicole said, "Yes, he is." Billy told her, "Don't worry about it. It's okay." "I'll be out soon. Bye, Nicole." He hung up with Nicole. Nicole didn't try to call back. She didn't try to stop him, but by now Jean was getting upset, and according to Billy, she started screaming at him. And as he walked back into the kitchen from the living room, she was yelling, "Why isn't Nicole with you? Where is she?" Billy told her Nicole was across the street, and again Jean told her to tell Nicole to get home for dinner now. That comment from Jean apparently started an argument between them, according to Billy. He would say that from then on everything went downhill. Everything he and Nicole had talked about over the past 4 days, including living together, getting married, running away, and hoping something would happen to Jean, was on his mind. He knew he could either walk away or attack Jean. So Billy had yelled at her that Nicole was picking something up at the store and that he was there to get his inhaler. Jean then walked back into the kitchen, and she was walking back and forth. Billy felt Jean was angry he was there and Nicole wasn't there. He said that made him even angrier, so they continued arguing about Nicole. Billy said he couldn't remember the exact words that Jean had spoken to him as they yelled back and forth. Billy said he had progressed to the point of no return. He insisted that all he could see was Jean's mouth moving. He couldn't hear anything. He wasn't listening to the words and couldn't understand them. It was an argument Billy admitted that he had probably provoked just to build up the guts to finish what he was set out to do. Billy confronted her with the bat in his hand, and he swung, planning to hit her in the head. Instead, he missed and hit her back. Now the impact pushed Jean. It startled her, but she didn't fall down. So after Jean realized what had happened, she turned, holding her back. This violence wasn't something she had expected. She knew Billy was unstable and had told her friends that there was something about him that just wasn't right, but she never thought he was capable of such violence. Billy later said after he struck Jean in the back, he then swung again and hit her in the head. The medical examiner's report shows a large laceration in the back of Jean's skull. Billy thought that he had now exposed his true self to Jean, so there's no way Jean is going to let him see Nicole again. So in his mind, he really had nothing left to lose. He threw himself at Jean, and they both fell on the coffee table in the living room. It then broke. Billy claimed that it was a struggle to keep Jean on the floor because she was a lot stronger than she looked. She was a fighter. At one point, Jean even managed to get out of his grasp and ran for the kitchen door. While Billy and Jean fought inside the house, Nicole sat in Billy's car and read the magazine she bought at 7-Eleven. Jean had almost made it out of the door, but Billy was close and pulled her back into the house. When she fell to the floor, she did try to get up, but Billy pushed her down again. Then Billy ran into the kitchen and grabbed a steak knife off the counter. Then, running back at Jean with a knife, he stabbed her in the right shoulder. Bearing down on the knife, it hit her bone, using so much force that the knife blade broke off. Then Billy grabbed a second knife from the butcher's block that Jean had been so against keeping in her house. He went straight for Jean's upper body and stabbed her in the throat. Billy said that he just couldn't stop himself from going after her. He even fantasized if there was something he could do to make Jean lose her memory so she wouldn't remember and he wouldn't have to kill her, so she'd forget what happened. So when Billy struck Jean with the second knife, he dropped it on the floor. Then she got up, picked up the knife, and ran at him. But when she tried to stab him, she slipped on her own blood. He said she went headfirst into the glass part of the door. Billy then grabbed a third knife and frantically stabbed at her. He kept stabbing her until she stopped moving. Billy remembers stabbing Jean 8 times, but really, he stabbed her 21 times in her back, 1 time in her wrists, 7 times in her chest and throat, 6 times in her face, 13 times on her right side of her head, 2 times on the left side of her head, and 9 times in the back of her neck and head. When Billy finally stopped stabbing her, he ran for the door. What he didn't notice was that he had left bloody prints on the knives, on the baseball bat, and a palm print on the refrigerator. Nicole was still in Billy's car, wondering what was going on and why he was taking so long. Billy was panicking as he stood by the door, wondering what he should do next. He was absolutely covered with blood. He needed to change his clothes to get back to the car and then leave. Had he been a little longer, Chris would have undoubtedly caught him in the act. He walked over Jean's body and ran up the stairs, leaving a path of bloody footprints. When he got upstairs, Billy grabbed a jacket. Then he ran down the stairs. He spread the jacket on the floor. He took off the pile of bloody clothes that he had on. He then he went into the bathroom to wash the blood off of his arms, his face, and arms before putting on a clean set of clothes, but he still had quite a bit of blood on him. After that, he did get dressed. He ran out the door to the 7-Eleven where Nicole was leaning against the car reading her magazine. Billy told her it was done. He said that he had left his inhaler in the house and he needed a towel. So she was going to have to go back inside the house. Billy had done enough. He said, "It's your turn." So he pulled out of the 7-Eleven, driving at about 60 miles an hour, and made a sharp right turn onto the road. Told Nicole that she had to go into the house for him. He needed a wet towel to get more blood off of him. Nicole was crying, and she said she didn't want to see her mother, and she couldn't believe he had actually killed Jean. What? But she wasn't terribly upset, because the next thing she said, according to Billy, was, "Well, now we're going to be together." Billy would say she seemed happy and relieved. So Billy pulled into Jean's driveway and told Nicole to meet him back at the 7-Eleven. As Billy pulled out of the driveway, Nicole walked toward the house, but after opening the screen door, she tried to push open the main door into the house, but it wouldn't move. Something was blocking the door. So she forced it open a crack and saw that it was her mother's dead body. It was blocking the door from opening. She was about to leave, but she remembered that Billy was counting on her. So she managed to push the door open, and she stepped over her mother's body. Looking into the bathroom, grabbing a towel and wetting it, she headed for the door. She noticed the broken knife blade on the floor, so she picked it up as she left and ran toward the bank parking lot where Billy was waiting for her. On the other side of Billy's car, there was a sewer drain, so Nicole dropped the knife blade into the drain and got into the car. Just down the road from Jean's house was the mall. Billy parked there after stopping by an ATM to withdraw some money. He told Nicole to go into the mall and get some clothes. She was shaking and crying at that point, but she agreed. After buying a shirt, Nicole ran out to the parking lot and hopped back in Billy's car. Next, Billy stopped at the JCPenney store just up the street. Nicole went in and bought a pair of pants and socks for him. She put the receipt into her front pocket. Billy then drove to the AMC movie theater so he could change clothes in the back parking lot. They then drove to the golf course. He pulled up into the driveway and found a dirty road which led to a wooded area. Billy pulled into the secluded area and popped his trunk. Then Nicole jumped out, grabbed everything in the trunk she could find, and put them into a bag. She found a tree and tossed the bag behind it. Billy then suggested they go see Jean's best friend, Rebecca, to set up an alibi. So this would have been around 10 p.m. So after they visited with Rebecca, Billy drove back to the house to see what was going on. So he stopped at the Dunkin' Donuts and told Nicole to make sure the trunk was empty. Standing underneath the parking lot lights, she noticed a handle of a knife and picked it up and threw it in the bushes. Their fingerprints and their palm prints and evidence were everywhere. It's so ridiculous. Their DNA and prints were on everything. You know they're gonna get caught pretty quickly. Before they drove back to the house, Billy had Nicole promise that she would never tell anyone what had happened. So much for promises. That lasted until the police started questioning them. Billy Sullivan and Nicole Kasinskas were each charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. It was decided that Nicole would be charged as an adult, which is pretty ironic since she wanted to be emancipated. She got her wish. She's going to be treated as a grown-up. They both face life without the possibility of parole, which is the automatic sentence for first-degree murder in New Hampshire. Interestingly enough, Billy wrote to several different girls all over New England while he was incarcerated. So much for that great love. Billy is nothing more than a psychopath and a manipulator. Billy had a past history of meeting young girls, telling them what they wanted to hear in order for him to get what he wanted. One girl was only 15 years old at the time, ended up testifying for the prosecution at Billy's trial. She said that Billy had written over 100 letters to her from prison, and Billy had told this girl that he would marry her if she would just convince Nicole to testify that someone else had killed Jean. But Nicole accepted a plea deal, and if she testified against Billy, she was sentenced to 40 years with 5 years reduced if she completed an education program while in prison. She had 2.5 years taken off her sentence for furthering her education, and the terms of her deal allow her to seek a further reduction after she serves 2/3 of her sentence, which won't be until 2031. Chris McGowan told the local news correspondent that he felt Nicole was just as guilty as Billy and should have been sentenced the same. Life in prison has a way of changing people's beliefs in each other. Billy couldn't stand people telling him what to do. Now he has prison guards telling him what to do for the rest of his life. Christopher McGowan would go on to say Jean was 1 in a million. He said later that I don't care how cliche it sounds, will never be another woman in my life like her. There were many times when Chris drove around in his car listening to the same music he and Jean had enjoyed together, and when he felt he needed to talk to her or get close to her, he would often make the 2-hour trip to her grave in Massachusetts and sat and thought about the times that they'd had together. Jean's death really did damage Chris' desire to move on in life. After 2 years, he still couldn't imagine his life with another woman. Even the judge said to Nicole at her sentencing, William Sullivan may be a psychopath, but there's one thing that's very clear to me in this case. The murder of your mother wouldn't have happened without your complicity. Jean Domenico was a good mother and would have been an outstanding future wife. Too bad she had an extremely selfish and narcissistic daughter who couldn't see past what she wanted. May she rest in eternal peace. And I pray Billy and Nicole see the error of their ways and turn out to be better people for it. They definitely have many years to think about. My deepest condolences to Jean Domenico's family and friends, and I pray that you find peace. God bless you all. This is Notorious Minds. Please like, share, and by all means subscribe to this channel. Please remember to click the notification bell and you will be notified when I upload new videos. Until next time, thank you.
I lived with both of my parents and my younger brother until I was 11 years old, and my parents got divorced, and so my dad moved out. I think after my parents got divorced and I was dealing with that, I became a little bit angrier because of the way that our relationship was, because he had become so much a part of my life. And I mean, I really didn't feel like I was anything without him. I had nothing in my life at that time. I felt at that time about ultimately what happened. I guess I don't really want to go into too many details, but I was 16 and he was 18. He killed my mom.